Her passport was still in the drawer. Her shoes were still by the door. Her coat, the one thing you cannot survive a Newfoundland winter without, was still hanging exactly where she left it. Jennifer Hillier-Penney walked into a house on November 30th, 2016. She never walked out of it. Not with her keys. Not with her belongings. Not on her own 2 feet. For almost 7 years, the only person who knew what happened to her said nothing. Then police built him an entire fake criminal empire, undercover agents, invented identities, even a job offer to captain a yacht that didn't exist, just to get him to talk. It worked. Twice he confessed. But here's what almost nobody saw coming. The confession that finally solved this case may have come from a place so unreliable, a jury had to spend days deciding whether to believe a single word of it. And even now, with a guilty verdict on the books, one piece of this story is still missing, the one piece that matters most. This is the story of Jennifer Hillier-Penney. Picture the place first. St. Anthony sits at the very top of Newfoundland's Great Northern Peninsula, a fishing town of roughly 2,200 people, wedged between rock and ocean at the edge of the continent. The kind of place where winter arrives early and stays late, where the economy runs on the tides, and where almost everyone's name means something to almost everyone else. In a town that size, there are no strangers, which means that when someone disappears, the entire community feels the hole left behind. Jennifer had grown up nearby, in Saint Lunaire-Griquet, one of 7 siblings raised in a large, close, unmistakably tight-knit family. Ask anyone who knew her, and the words repeat themselves, almost word for word. Kind, funny, passionate about the people around her. No enemies, just people who loved her, and plenty of them. She became a mother early. At 17, she gave birth to her first daughter, Marina, with her high school boyfriend, a local fisherman named Dean Penny. It wasn't the life most people would have planned for themselves at that age, but in a town where families have always leaned on each other, it worked, at least for a while. Jennifer and Dean married a few years later, when Marina was around 4 years old. A second daughter, Deanna, followed not long after. Jennifer eventually settled into a job as a clerk at the local hospital. Steady work, familiar faces, the kind of routine that anchors a small-town life. From the outside, this looked like an ordinary story. A marriage built on teenage love that somehow held together, 2 daughters growing from toddlers into teenagers, a house by the water in the same town where Dean had fished his entire life, family photographs, road trips in the summer, the kind of life that, on paper, resembles thousands of other lives across rural Newfoundland. But something had been shifting underneath that surface for a long time. Marriages built at 17 don't always survive into adulthood unchanged, and this one hadn't. Jennifer wanted out. Not in some vague someday sense. By every account from the people closest to her, she was actively working up the courage to leave her marriage for good, planning, quietly, for a different life. And her daughter would later describe something more specific than simple unhappiness. Under oath, years later, she would say that her mother had shown her, in small, quiet ways, that she was afraid of her husband. Not through violence her daughter ever personally witnessed. Nothing dramatic enough to point to and say, that was the moment. Just a feeling. A tension that lived in certain rooms. The particular way a woman's shoulders change when a certain car pulls into the driveway. Hold on to that detail. Fear that leaves no mark is still fear, and for years, it will remain one of the only windows anyone gets into what was actually happening behind that marriage's closed doors. On the evening of November 30th, 2016, Jennifer finished her shift at the hospital around 4 in the afternoon and made the half-hour drive to see her father, back in the town where she'd grown up. It was routine, ordinary, the kind of visit a woman makes dozens of times a year without anyone remembering the specific date. Later that same night, she drove to her estranged husband's home in St. Anthony, not to reconcile, not to move back in, simply to spend the evening with their daughter, the way separated parents do, all the time, in households everywhere. On its face, nothing about it looked unusual. Nothing about it looked dangerous. She was last seen alive that night, inside that house. By morning, she was gone. Her daughter woke up to an empty home, and not a home that looked like her mother had merely stepped out for the morning. A home that looked like her mother had vanished mid-motion, as though something had interrupted an otherwise ordinary night and never let her finish it. Her purse, still sitting on the counter, her car keys, still hanging on the hook by the door, her passport, untouched, in its usual place. Her shoes, lined up where she always left them. Her coat, in November, in a place where the wind coming off the Atlantic can strip the warmth out of a body in minutes, still hanging on its hook. No woman walks willingly into that kind of cold without her jacket. Not for a quick errand. Not for a walk to clear her head. Nobody does that. Not on purpose. Word spread through St. Anthony fast, the way it always does in a town where news doesn't need social media to travel. Jennifer Hillier-Penney was missing, and almost immediately, something about the manner of her disappearance struck the people who loved her as deeply, unmistakably wrong. This wasn't a woman who packed a bag and started over somewhere new. This was a woman who disappeared without taking a single object she would have needed to survive even one night outside that house. The RCMP opened an investigation, and then, for the family, the case seemed to fold in on itself into silence. What followed was one of the cruelest, slowest forms of grief there is, the kind with no shape to it, no funeral to plan, no grave to visit, just an absence that never resolved into anything else. Year after year, the Hillier family was told the investigation remained active, ongoing, that things were happening behind the scenes. But from where they sat, waiting by phones that didn't ring with news, reading the same unchanged case file summaries, nothing ever seemed to move forward. By 2018, nearly 2 years after Jennifer vanished, the family had reached a breaking point. They felt abandoned by the very institution meant to bring her home. Desperate for any kind of momentum, any kind of pressure that might shake something loose, they turned to the media. CBC's investigative program, The Fifth Estate, took up the case, sending reporters into St. Anthony, into St. Lunaire-Griquet, sitting down with Jennifer's friends and family, slowly reconstructing the last months of her life. What emerged, piece by piece, was a portrait of a woman who had been quietly trying to leave a marriage, and a husband who, by every indication, did not want her to go. And then, just days before that investigation was set to air, something strange happened. A publication ban was issued, a legal order restricting exactly what the broadcaster could and could not say about the case. For a family already starving for information, already convinced they were being kept in the dark by the people investigating their sisters, their daughters, their mother's disappearance, The ban only deepened the sense that something far larger than they could see was happening just beyond their line of sight. They were right, they just didn't know how right. Because while the public saw nothing but silence, while the family sat in that unbearable holding pattern of no news, no arrests, no closure, the RCMP was quietly running one of the most expensive, most elaborate undercover operations in the province's history. It's called a Mr. Big sting, and once you understand exactly how one is built, you'll understand precisely why this case took the better part of a decade to crack open. Here is the architecture of it. An undercover officer makes first contact with the target, casually, almost invisibly. A friendship, a shared interest, sometimes a job opportunity, nothing that raises any alarm. Slowly, patiently, the target is drawn into what looks and feels like a real criminal organization. Small favors come first. Low-risk tasks, the kind of thing that feels harmless enough to go along with, even flattering, even exciting. Over months, then years, the relationships deepen, the tasks escalate, the target begins to believe, on some level, that this fictional world is real, a brotherhood, an opportunity, in some cases, even a source of income he comes to genuinely depend on. And at the very top of that invented world sits Mr. Big, the boss. A figure the target rarely meets face to face, and when he finally does, it's treated by everyone involved as a moment of profound significance. Because Mr. Big is the one person in the organization who can supposedly make any problem disappear. Even a murder charge, but only, always, if he's given the complete, unfiltered truth first. For Dean Penney, this operation ran for more than 4 years. Undercover officers, working under false names and entirely invented identities, built a relationship with him brick by brick. They had him complete tasks for their fictional organization in locations across the country. In some ways, according to what would later come out at trial, he grew closer to some of these officers than to almost anyone else in his life at the time. And then came the twist buried inside the sting itself, the detail that sounds almost too strange to be real. Years into the operation, an undercover officer posing as the crime boss sat Dean Penney down for what looked, in every respect, like a genuine job interview. Captain of a yacht. Sit with that for a second. A fisherman from a town of 2,200 people, on the northern edge of Newfoundland, being courted for a captain's position by a man he believed ran a national criminal network. It sounds almost absurd, until you realize the absurdity was the entire point. The more real, the more valuable, the more prestigious this fictional world felt, the more Dean Penney stood to lose by walking away from it, and the more he had to prove if he wanted to keep his place inside it. It was during that same interview that the trap finally closed around him. The undercover officer told Penney the organization had learned something troubling, that police were closing in, and that he was about to be arrested for his wife's murder. And then came the offer that would ultimately change everything. Another member of the group, the boss explained, was terminally ill, dying, and willing to take the blame for a murder he hadn't committed, in exchange for one thing, the truth, every detail, so the story would hold up if it ever needed to be repeated to police. All Dean Penney had to do was say what really happened on the night his wife disappeared. And according to the Crown's case at trial, in November of 2023, nearly 7 years after Jennifer was last seen alive, he did exactly that. He told the undercover officer that his estranged wife had died during a heated argument inside their St. Anthony home, that he had pushed her, that she'd fallen down a set of stairs, and the fall had killed her. He described placing her body inside a bag, hiding what had happened from their daughter, somewhere nearby in that same house, and finally, disposing of her body somewhere in the ocean. He told this story twice, to the same undercover officer, weeks apart. 2 separate confessions, delivered to a man who was never, at any point, who Dean Penney believed him to be. In December of 2023, Dean Penney was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Now here is where the story should get simple. A confession, an arrest, a trial. Justice, finally, delivered after 7 years of silence. Except it wasn't simple at all, because the defense had a single question the entire case would eventually hinge on, a question that would keep a jury deliberating for days. If a man confesses to a crime, believing his life depends on convincing a fictional criminal boss he's telling the truth, is that confession actually the truth? Or is it simply the most convincing performance of his life? The trial opened in April of 2026, inside the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador, in Corner Brook. It stretched on for nearly 2 full months. The Crown built its case around the confession, but not only the confession. A cellular analysis expert testified that Penney's phone had made over 100 outgoing calls in the days surrounding Jennifer's disappearance, and that the specific towers those calls connected to could place him at specific locations, at specific times. On the day Jennifer vanished, that data placed him at his cabin during the morning hours, and then, for 4 hours that evening, inside St. Anthony itself, the very hours during which Jennifer disappeared and was never seen alive again. The defense pushed back with everything available to them. Penney's lawyer told the jury there was no definitive proof that Jennifer Hillier-Penney was even dead, that without a body, the Crown was asking 12 people to convict a man based entirely on words extracted inside a world built by police, populated by police, run by police. He argued the confession was fundamentally unreliable, possibly coerced. A false confession, he reminded the jury, can happen when a person genuinely believes his life is on the line. Then Dean Penney did something few defendants ever choose to do. He took the witness stand himself, for days, and told the court a very different version of the story. He said he was innocent, that he had lied to the undercover officer, that every detail, the stairs, the bag, the ocean, had been invented, told under what he described as intimidation from a man he genuinely believed was a dangerous crime boss, capable of hurting him or the people he loved. The Crown pressed him on the obvious hole sitting in the middle of that account. If he had truly been terrified for his life, why did he stay involved with this fictional group for years, accepting tasks, deepening the relationships, rather than pulling away the moment it started to feel dangerous? Penney's answer was that he stayed for the money, despite being, in his own words, scared out of his senses. The Crown pushed harder still. If the confession was nothing more than fear-talking, why was it so specific, so detailed, so internally consistent, told twice, weeks apart, without falling apart under its own weight? Penney's answer from the witness box was almost as unsettling as the confession itself. He said he had tried to make the story sound as convincing as possible, because he believed that was exactly what the men in that room wanted to hear, that a more graphic, more detailed account would land as more believable. Somewhere in the middle of that 2-month trial, Jennifer's own daughter Marina took the stand. The same daughter who had woken up to an empty house in 2016, at just a teenager, and never gotten a straight answer since. She testified about her parents' relationship, about the fear she had sensed in her mother, even without ever witnessing outright violence between them. By this point in her life, she had long been open, publicly and privately, about believing her father was guilty. A daughter, forced by circumstance into an open courtroom, testifying about which parent she believed had taken the other away from her, permanently. The jury began deliberating on a Wednesday evening. Midway through, they sent back an unusual request. They wanted to watch the complete, unedited footage of both of Penney's interviews with the undercover officer, hours upon hours of raw, unfiltered material. They also asked for the formal legal definitions of 2 specific words, coercion and coercive impact. It was the clearest possible sign of exactly what this jury was wrestling with. Nobody disputed that Dean Penney had said those words, on tape, to an undercover officer. The real question, the only question that actually mattered, was whether those words were the truth, or whether they were a performance, delivered by a frightened man trying to survive a trap he didn't fully understand he was standing inside of. They deliberated for days. On a Sunday morning in May of 2026, the jury filed back into the courtroom, 12 people, 1 verdict, on 1 charge, guilty. First-degree murder. The sound that broke out across that courtroom wasn't cheering. It was something closer to a scream, nearly a decade of grief, finally given permission to surface all at once. Marina, the daughter who had spent years publicly insisting her father was guilty, collapsed into her family's arms. In the front row, where he had sat every single day of that 2-month trial, Jennifer's brother, Gary Hillier, had spent the proceedings gripping the bench in front of him, by his own admission, a physical strategy to keep himself from lunging over the railing that separated him from the man accused of killing his sister. When the verdict finally landed, all of that restraint gave way at once. Outside the courthouse, an RCMP inspector spoke to reporters about the operation his officers had carried out, one of the most resource-intensive investigations the province had ever run. He described years with no visible progress from the public's perspective, mixed quietly with breakthroughs that kept the case alive, long after most people had assumed it had gone cold. From day one, he said, the goal never changed: find the truth, and find Jennifer. And this is where a story like this one usually ends. A verdict. A family, finally, with an answer, after almost 10 years of waiting for one. Except there's a twist buried inside this case that even a guilty verdict couldn't resolve. Jennifer Hillier-Penney has still never been found. According to the story Penney told 2 undercover officers, men he believed were dangerous criminals, not police officers building a case against him, his wife's body was placed inside a bag and disposed of somewhere in the ocean off the Newfoundland coast. If that account is true, the same water that has fed and sustained that community for generations may be the very thing that keeps Jennifer from ever coming home. So sit with that for a moment. This case wasn't cracked open by a crime scene. There wasn't one, just an empty house, and a coat still hanging on its hook. It wasn't cracked open by a witness who saw something happen in the dark. It was cracked open because investigators spent over 4 years constructing an entire fictional world for one man to live inside of, patiently waiting for him to trust that world enough to finally tell it the truth. Which leaves behind an uncomfortable question: one the jury had to answer, and one this story leaves with you. What does it mean when a confession is completely real, every single word spoken by the man's own mouth, but the room it was given in was built entirely out of lies? 12 people looked at that exact question and came down decisively on one side of it. But here is the twist that stays with you long after the verdict. The case that took 7 years, one of the most expensive investigations in Newfoundland and Labrador's history, and an entire fabricated criminal empire to finally solve, still hasn't given Jennifer's family the one thing they have wanted since the night of November 30th, 2016. Her. Jennifer Hillier-Penney was 38 years old. A mother, a daughter, a sister. Somewhere along that cold Atlantic coastline, she may still be out there, the last unresolved piece of a case that took almost a decade, and an elaborate lie, to finally come this close to the truth. If this case pulled you in the way it pulled us, consider subscribing. There are more stories like Jennifer's, still waiting to be told.